Still exhausted after sleep.
A majority of individuals facing burnout believe they are simply lazy. This is the assumption they make. Because they hold this belief, they force themselves more, relax less, and end up feeling unhealthier, which seemingly proves their self-diagnosis. This cycle continues until a breaking point occurs. Here is the truth. Being lazy and being burnt out appear exactly the same to observers. Either one leads to a lack of productivity. The contrast lies beneath the surface. Laziness stems from lacking drive. Burnout stems from lacking internal fuel. You are unable to simply cheerlead yourself out of an empty tank. That is akin to screaming at a vehicle lacking gasoline. The fatigue of burnout fails to react to slumber the way standard fatigue normally would. You secure 8 to 9 hours, yet rise sensing as if you slept 0. That is the clue. Standard exhaustion heals through sleeping. Burnout resides in a zone where mere resting cannot penetrate in one night. Your reservoir is not simply dry, your reservoir is shattered.
Small tasks feel overwhelming.
You possess a checklist of duties that ought to require 20 minutes in total. You have stared at it multiple occasions. You have ignored it entirely. You cannot adequately articulate the reason. That is your frontal brain region depleting its power. It manages scheduling, making choices, and starting activities. It happens to be the primary network to falter during prolonged tension. Once it crashes, even basic actions seem as though they demand energy that simply does not exist. Here is the twisted reality. The chores that seem the most inconquerable are typically the simplest ones in theory. Answering a single message, dialing a single phone number. The space dividing their apparent simplicity and their overwhelming difficulty is exactly what causes exhausted individuals to believe they are going crazy. They are not. Their internal engine is simply malfunctioning.
Procrastinating things you care about.
Dodging obligations you despise is logical. However, once you begin dodging activities you actually desire to complete, that is when reality feels confusing. Burnout does not merely destroy your ability to handle heavy labor, it destroys your ability to engage in activities that hold significance. Since significant activities involve risks, risks demand mental power. Plus, once your network runs dry, your mind perceives psychological importance as a danger and retreats away from anything that holds value in order to guard whatever tiny amount remains available. That is the snare. This retreating appears as if you lost your passion. You never lost your passion, you simply exhausted the fuel that passion needs to transform into physical movement. These concepts are entirely distinct. Viewing them as identical is the reason a majority of exhausted individuals view themselves as losers in addition to their other struggles.
Your focus crashes fast.
You take a seat, handle 20 minutes of genuine attention, and suddenly you vanish, bodily in the room, but mentally transported to an entirely separate place. Prolonged focus represents one of the most energy-draining functions your mind performs. During burnout, your starting level is currently so drained that any attempt to concentrate begins on empty. The available time frame contracts. You waste 3 hours sitting at a workstation, accomplishing what previously required 45 minutes. So, how do the majority react? They work longer to make up for it, which empties an already dry reserve quicker, which narrows the time frame even more, which forces them to work even more hours. The calculation here never gets better organically.
Emotionally flat, numb.
Positive updates carry no weight. A genuinely humorous event occurs and you process logically that it possesses humor without genuinely feeling the amusement. You observe your own life from a minor gap, never truly experiencing any intense emotion. Once your biological network has endured prolonged tension for an extended period, it mutes your psychological reactions, serving as a defense strategy. Indicative reasoning to developing thick skin. Your biology toughens the zones that constantly absorb damage. The issue is it lacks precision. It fails to lower strictly the painful emotions. It dampens every single one. Happiness, thrill, intimacy, they all fade into silence simultaneously. You do not feel less awful, you just feel less of everything entirely. Plus, over time, this hollowness transforms into a unique sort of struggle.
Irritated by small things.
A person eats noisily and you experience an emotional flare-up that feels utterly unreasonable. A trivial hassle generates annoyance that shocks your own self. You lash out at somebody and afterward can't entirely understand where the anger originated from. Patience for annoyance acts as a fuel supply, similar to attention and making choices. It breaks down during prolonged pressure. Once your tank runs dry, your breaking point plummets. Problems that bounced off your back 6 months prior currently trigger an outburst simply because zero buffer remains to cushion the blow. Here is the unpleasant reality.
The individuals who absorb the brunt of this are practically always those nearest to your heart. You have spent hours regulating your behavior throughout the shift for colleagues and strangers. The moment you arrive at your house, the filter is destroyed. The loved ones who never deserved the unfiltered attitude receive the harshest side instead.
Dreading once easy work.
Your job never altered, you did. The terror of burnout feels different from standard anxiety. Standard anxiety targets a clear objective. This terror feels scattered. It involves opening your eyes and sensing an absolute block against the entire morning before a single negative event takes place. The heavy burden of existence before the clock even begins. Projects you previously tackled possessing a decent amount of motivation now seem like an unscalable barrier before you even make contact. This change is evidence. Your mind is producing a drastically altered response to an identical trigger. This is not a willpower deficit. This indicates a biological malfunction. Plus, forcing your way past a biological malfunction with brute strength is precisely how you turn a biological malfunction into a total biological collapse.
Anxious about falling behind?
You could theoretically not even be delayed, or perhaps you are delayed, yet solely because exhaustion rendered you less efficient, which triggered the feeling of lagging behind, which implied the panic, which ultimately worsened the exhaustion. You are not pursuing an actual deficit. You are pursuing a deficit that your biological network constantly invents. Burnout panic lacks a clear villain. It shadows you throughout your days off. It appears the moment you attempt to relax. It remains an endless underlying vibration of losing a race you cannot accurately pinpoint. That is the snare. Your mind is executing a defense protocol against an enemy it cannot find, so it remains activated endlessly, burning vital energy to protect you from a hazard that originates from within your own biology, rather than external forces. There exists zero puzzle to fix. The siren is simply jammed.
Hard to start tasks?
Wrapping things up proves difficult for everybody. Occasionally, when starting the work morphs into the most difficult phase of any project, that represents a distinct warning sign demanding your attention. Activity commencement demands a spark of energy straight from the frontal brain lobe. During exhaustion, this spark costs a fortune in ways it typically doesn't. Your mind fights against burning that fuel, so you stare at the project, launch it and shut it, contemplate acting upon it without actually executing it for periods far exceeding any logical time frame. Here's the catch. The moment you truly begin, it typically flows smoothly. The actual project isn't the hurdle. The starter motor is shattered, and handling a shattered starter as a simple motivation deficit represents a total squandering of effort.
Breaks don't restore you.
Grab a pause, you return, feeling precisely the identical fatigue, or heavier. The relaxation fails to absorb, reaching a specific level of exhaustion.
Your biological network cannot completely transition toward healing status, even if you provided the chance to do so. The underlying panic reflex remains semi-active. You remain bodily motionless, whereas your mind continues racing. That represents the aspect folks overlook. They grab time off, sense zero relief, and deduce relaxing isn't the cure. It absolutely is the cure. Your biology is merely overly triggered to absorb it correctly. Your downtime isn't flawed. The emptiness runs overly profound for shallow relaxing to fix. This represents an entirely separate issue, and it demands much heavier intervention than a 3-day weekend.
Withdrawing socially.
You bail on events you would have eagerly anticipated a half-year prior. You allow text threads to die off. It doesn't mean you resent those friends. It signifies that even basic chatting demands fuel you simply lack right now. Interacting socially remains mentally pricey. During burnout, your mind begins viewing interactions identically to how it views labor, an expense it cannot cover. Therefore, it retreats involuntarily. Here lies the brutal irony. Bonding socially acts as one of the absolute best healing tools to combat tension. Exhaustion deletes the exact tool that might offer the greatest relief, and it executes this instinctively prior to you actively making a choice at all. You never elect to isolate. Your biology dictates that decision on your behalf without seeking permission.
Guilty while resting.
You are accomplishing absolutely nothing. That remains the goal. Yet somewhat below the surface level of nothingness exists a silent, endless shame regarding failing to remain useful, which implies your downtime is poisoned by the precise stressor that rendered the downtime required in the first place. Genuine recovery demands your biological network to genuinely power down. Shame forces it to remain semi-triggered. You find yourself resting horizontally, whereas your mind executes a panicked underlying program questioning if laying horizontally is even permitted. Thus, the relaxation fails to register biologically. You are never truly recovering. You merely act out the motions of rest while panicking over taking a break. At some point in life, you internalized that your value remains linked to your productivity. Once the productivity halts, this formula operates in reverse. Deconstructing this mindset does not represent a bonus step to healing. It literally forms the healing process.
Brain fog? Memory issues?
You blank on details you would typically hold on to. You review a passage and fail to remember it a half-minute afterward. You stroll inside a space and the purpose vanishes entirely. This seems unfamiliar and somewhat terrifying. Prolonged tension spikes your cortisol levels. Endlessly high cortisol damages the brain's hippocampus. That acts as your mental filing cabinet. This cloudiness possesses a scientific cause. Your recall fails not because you possess an inherent, permanent flaw within your character. It crashes due to the fact that your mind has soaked inside tension-based chemicals sufficiently long to drag that specific network beneath its functional limits. This damage heals, however, not while the root pressure continues operating at maximum overdrive. This reality explains why pushing harder despite the mental haze represents the singular tactic absolutely assured to render the haze thicker.
You're doing less, but feel more drained.
Your productivity has plummeted. You accomplish fewer things than previously, yet inexplicably you feel significantly more tired than back when you accomplished double. This paradox baffles individuals severely enough that they typically default toward an incorrect conclusion. The reality stands that exhaustion stacks a permanent, unseen burden. Measuring the tangible tasks fails to factor in the underlying panic, the constant psychological bottling, the massive strain of jump-starting each activity, alongside the mental price tag of constantly feeling delayed. All of this operates non-stop, regardless of whether you remain laboring or resting. You never actually accomplish less overall. You simply output less observable effort, whereas your unseen burden has skyrocketed tremendously. This divide, separating how minuscule your external efforts seem compared to how destroyed you physically feel, is precisely what forces burnt-out individuals to assume they simply act lazy. This assumption remains totally false, plus it acts as the exact assumption trapping them in the cycle.
Pushing harder makes it worse.
This represents the final sign, and it stands as the most crucial. Exhaustion reacts to willpower in the exact inverse manner that standard tiredness would. Standard fatigue, you power through it, you complete the job, you rest, you bounce back fine. Burnt out, you force your way through it. Your output briefly stabilizes, your inner emptiness deepens, your subsequent effort demands an even higher price. You force yourself tougher to make up the difference. Consequently, the breakdown speeds up. The more intensely you fight it, the quicker the crash arrives. Here lies the truth. That impulse to just try harder remains perfectly valid across the majority of scenarios. It simply fails catastrophically in this specific scenario. Yet it continuously gets applied simply because it functioned brilliantly in the past. Whenever life grew tough, applying more force fixed the issue. Therefore, your mind grabs the exact weapon that traditionally conquered difficult obstacles. Burnout does not represent a difficult obstacle. It signifies an empty engine. Plus, placing heavier strain onto an empty engine never acts as a cure. It represents the exact method an empty engine degrades into a completely shattered one. Acknowledging that your current approach remains actively worsening the condition stands as the initial genuine step forward. A majority of folks reach this realization merely after seasons of proving it to themselves via brutal experience.